For 5,000 years, money was gold. It was heavy, it was scarce, and it was real. Empires rose and fell, kings were crowned and buried, but gold remained the anchor. If you held a paper bill, it wasn't just paper, it was a claim check, a promise that you owned a specific amount of physical wealth sitting in a vault somewhere. Then on one Sunday evening in 1971, it became nothing. It is August 15th, 1971. A humid summer night in Washington, D.C. The popular TV show Bonanza is interrupted. Millions of Americans look up from their dinners, annoyed, expecting a breaking news bulletin about the Vietnam War. Instead, they see President Richard Nixon. He looks serious, determined. He is about to say words that will effectively delete the history of money and rewrite the future of the global economy. He tells the world that the United States is temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. That word did a lot of heavy lifting, because that temporary measure never ended. In that moment, the dollar went from being a check backed by gold to a piece of paper backed by faith. Here is the story of the day money died and the day your savings started losing value. To understand the shock, we have to rewind to 1944. World War II is raging, but the Allies know they are going to win. They meet at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to decide how the world economy will work after the dust settles. The United States is the only major power left standing with its factories intact and its vaults full. In fact, the U.S. holds nearly 2/3 of the world's gold, so a deal is struck. The world will use the U.S. dollar for trade, and the U.S. dollar will be pegged to gold at exactly $30 an ounce. It was a beautiful system. It meant that if you were the central bank of France or Japan or the UK and you had US dollars, you could knock on America's door and say, "I'd like my gold, please." And America had to give it to you. The dollar was as good as gold. For a while, this worked. The stability of the dollar allowed global trade to flourish. But there was a flaw in the system, a flaw that economists like Robert Triffin saw coming miles away. It was called the Triffin dilemma. Here is the trap. For the world to trade, they needed dollars. To get dollars to the world, the U.S. had to spend money abroad, buying imports, building bases, sending aid. But the more dollars the U.S. sent out, the more claim checks were floating around for the gold sitting in Fort Knox. Eventually, there would be more paper claims than there was actual gold. Fast forward to the 1960s. The United States is burning the candle at both ends. President Lyndon B. Johnson wants to fight a war on poverty at home, the Great Society, and a war against communism in Vietnam. Economists call this guns and butter. Wars are expensive. Welfare is expensive. How do you pay for both without raising taxes so high that the public revolts? You print money. The Federal Reserve kept interest rates low. The government spent dollars like they were going out of style. Inflation started to creep up. The cost of living rose, and importantly, the world started to notice. The French were the first to call the bluff. President Charles de Gaulle, a man who cared deeply about French sovereignty, looked at the pile of US dollars France held and realized something terrifying. The Americans were exporting their inflation to Europe. He famously called it America's exorbitant privilege. America could print money to buy French factories, and all France got in return was paper. So de Gaulle did something bold. He sent the French Navy across the Atlantic to pick up France's gold. He traded in his dollars. He was not the only one. Other nations started getting nervous. The Switzerland National Bank, the Germans, everyone started looking at their dollars and then looking at Fort Knox. The gold drain began. The U.S. gold reserves plummeted from over 20,000 metric tons in the 1950s to nearly half that by 1971. The run on the bank had started. By August 1971, the situation was critical. The British ambassador showed up at the U.S. Treasury asking for cover for $3 billion worth of gold. That was the breaking point. If America paid the British, the vaults would be dangerously empty. On Friday, August 13th, President Nixon secretly gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David. This was not a formal summit. It was a crisis management team. The cast of characters in that room would shape history. There was John Connally, the Treasury Secretary, a tall, swaggering Texan with no background in economics but a PhD in politics. He famously told the Europeans, "The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem." There was Paul Volcker, the Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, a giant of a man, literally and figuratively, who understood the technical disaster they were facing. And there was George Shultz, the budget director, representing the Chicago School of Economics, men influenced by Milton Friedman who believed that maybe, just maybe, gold was an outdated relic. For 3 days, they debated. The atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and tension. They knew what they were about to do would shatter the Bretton Woods Agreement. It would anger America's allies. It might cause a global depression. Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, argued passionately against closing the gold window. He warned Nixon, Pravda, the Russian newspaper, will write that this is a sign of the collapse of capitalism. But John Connally pushed back. He argued that they had no choice. The speculators were winning, the gold was leaving. They had to prioritize American jobs and American exports over international obligations. Nixon, ever the politician, looked at the polling. Inflation was hurting him, unemployment was hurting him. The election of 1972 was coming up. He needed a quick fix. He needed to shake up the psychology of the market. By Sunday afternoon, the decision was made. They would freeze wages and prices to stop inflation, a move that disastrously failed later, and they would close the gold window. They did not tell the foreign finance ministers. They did not tell the State Department. They barely told the speechwriters. When Nixon went on air that Sunday night, he pitched it as a defense of the American worker. He blamed international money speculators for waging war on the dollar. He said, "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." Most Americans did not understand the technical implication. They heard protecting the dollar. They heard stopping the price rises. The next day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average actually rose by 33 points, the biggest daily gain ever at that time. The public loved it. But in the backrooms of banks in London, Tokyo, and Paris, there was panic. The foreign exchange markets closed. For a week, the world's currencies were paralyzed. When they reopened, the era of fixed exchange rates was over. Currencies began to float against each other, their value determined not by a treaty, but by the chaotic, swirling forces of the free market. Nixon's team thought they could devalue the dollar slightly, fix the trade balance, and maybe go back to gold later. They were wrong. Once the genie was out of the bottle, it refused to go back in. Without the discipline of gold, there was no physical limit on how much money the government could print. And print they did. The 1970s became a decade of stagflation, stagnant growth, and rampant inflation. The price of oil skyrocketed. The price of sugar, wheat, and steel soared. By 1980, gold was not $35 an ounce. It hit $850 an ounce. Think about that. In less than a decade, the dollar lost more than 90% of its purchasing power relative to gold. This brings us to today. The system we live in now, the Fiat system, was born that Sunday night in 1971. Fiat is Latin for "let it be done." It means money has value simply because the government says it does and because we all agree to believe in it. This shift changed the fundamental psychology of saving. Before 1971, you could save money in a bank account and it would hold its value reasonably well over a lifetime. After 1971, holding cash became a losing strategy. If you put $100 under your mattress in 1971, today it would buy you roughly what $13 bought you back then. To preserve wealth, you were forced to become an investor. You had to put your money into the stock market, into real estate, into assets, anything that would inflate along with the money supply. This led to the financialization of everything. Houses stopped being just places to live. They became investment vehicles. Some historians and economists point to a specific chart, the wedge. From 1948 to 1971, American productivity and American wages grew side by side. If the country got richer, the workers got richer. After 1971, productivity kept going up, fueled by technology, but real wages flattened out. The wealth generated by the new system did not go to labor. It went to the assets. It went to those who own the stocks and the real estate. Why? Because when money is easy to print, it flows first to the financial sector, inflating asset prices, before it ever trickles down to your paycheck. This is known as the Cantillon effect, an 18th century theory that became painfully relevant in the post 1971 world. Richard Nixon died in 1994. The temporary suspension he announced is now over 50 years old. We often look at history as a series of wars and elections. But the invisible history, the history of money, is what determines the price of your bread, the value of your labor, and the security of your future. 1971 was the year the leash was taken off. Governments gained the power to smooth out economic crises by printing money and preventing another Great Depression. That is the benefit. We have avoided total collapse many times since then by flooding the system with liquidity. But the cost is a currency that perpetually bleeds value. The cost is a world where you must run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. So the next time you look at the price of groceries or the soaring cost of housing and you wonder, why is everything getting so expensive? Remember that Sunday evening in August. Things are not necessarily getting more expensive. Your money is just dying. In the end, the Nixon shock did not just change the economy. It changed the definition of value itself. We traded the hard discipline of gold for the flexibility of politics. We replaced a promise of metal with a promise of faith. And as we move further into an uncertain financial future, the echo of that humid Sunday night in 1971 still rings in our ears. The temporary measure became permanent, and the money in your pocket became an illusion. The game changed forever that night, and the only way to win it now is to know the rules.